We talked about this bunker project. We talked about the way in which German capital and state worked hand in glove to exploit labor, both foreign and domestic. This next part, this next lecture, Death by Labor, is going to be more about the domestic side, however. You saw that the slave laborers who were dragged into Germany from all over Europe celebrated when the liberating forces entered the towns, but they were not the only ones who celebrated. We return to my ancestral neighborhood here, where my great-grandfather had lived. He was the leader of a labor union. He was the president of the steelworkers local that organized, among other things, that shipyard. That was their main base. So he was, he had initially been a worker there. He was fired for union activity. He was a skilled organizer and thereby ended up elected as the chapter president, which is a modestly paid position. So he could live off that, he and his wife and his 10 children. Him and many thousands like him formed anti-fascist militias in the 1930s. The modus of the Nazis was, of course, to provoke by directly attacking communists, union members, social democrats, and so forth, or Jews, setting off self-defense, setting off skirmishes, then pointing to those as evidence of a growing menace from the left and of left-wing violence that threatened you, your family, and your children. And therefore, only the Nazis, only fascism, do away with that whole notion of everybody can just run around and say their opinion, no matter how ludicrously left-wing. We need somebody to really put down the foot and put these people in their place. So this was the selling point. And this division of labor between the thugs in the street and the political leadership, where each played the ball off each other, is a well-established template. And if you turn on Tucker Carlson on any given night, you can see it play out in the exact same fashion today. So the purpose of groups like these, the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold, this was an ex-front soldier association of social democrats and unionists. So they had combat experience and they were willing to defend democracy, the Weimar Republic and its constitution, with arms if necessary. The problem, of course, with the labor movement, and we'll return to that later, is that it was split. The communists, who also maintained a militia, and the social democrats were not on speaking terms. We'll have to revisit that because it's too much for this short lecture. But these were the very first people who, when the Nazis took power in late January of 1933, were sent to these wild concentration camps. That street that you saw in the early morning hours of May 2nd, 1933, is where the SA stormtroopers came and took away my great-grandfather. Here, you have a whole large group of people like that in Berlin at a central gathering place. I think this is supposed to be Berlin. Members of labor unions, non-governmental organizations of any kind that you would call them today, democratic parties, lawyers, professors, authors, musicians, radio announcers, etc. On May 2nd, one of the last large organizations that the Nazis knew would have the muscle to stop them, because in 1923 they had tried to take power and the workers' uprising had stopped them. It was the labor unions. A day after they had seen how it worked with taking over the working class celebration on May 1st. That was the International Day of Struggle of the Working Class. It was not a public holiday. There had been street battles with police and communists in the previous years. Now the Nazis made it a public holiday took it over and decided to have official mandatory parades where everybody from management on down would participate. And when that went down without much of a glitch, they decided the unions are ripe. And on May 2nd, they invaded their offices. Yeah.
How did civilians, for the most part, react to these early
It depends who you asked. I mean, the working class and that about 30 to 40% of the people were shocked. They had not seen it coming like that. And they were feeling helpless. There was also a large part of it, like a silent majority, if you will, of people who thought, well, maybe this is what's necessary. Maybe that'll finally give us some peace and it'll end this strife, this constant arguing. And maybe if somebody is in charge, that will really take care of things. And this may be a price worth paying. Sure, it's not a pretty picture, but I'm not a communist. And they're not coming for me. That's Bonhoeffer, right? When they came for the communists, I didn't say anything. And not just because I wasn't a communist, but because I really thought that the communists had it coming. I thought it was a good idea to lock up the I mean, Bonhoeffer was a right-wing Catholic. And then they kind of went from there. The liberals, they took a little bit longer. By the night of the long knives in 1934, they had made it to the right-wing conservatives, like General Schleicher, who had been maneuvering in around President Hindenburg to establish some kind of right-wing clerical fascist dictatorship without Hitler, and had failed. And then Hitler was the go-to option instead. Schleicher was shot at, point blank at his home that day. So they had finally come for the enablers, for the last group of conservatives who had held the door open for them, who had invited them in. Afterward, of course, everybody had been against it. That much is for sure. And everybody had seen it coming. My great-grandfather, I don't have any pictures of him, but here's an artistic representation, Heinrich Paulenz, so that you have some image to associate with him. All I have from him, and I don't even know where those ended up, were the gun and the lockbox with the union funds that he gave to my grandmother the day they came for him and said, keep this to see if the party doesn't call for an uprising. So, learn how to use this gun. And this is an aerial photograph of the neighborhood where that family lived. Rönnebeek here is a community of Blumenthal here. That's where the shipyard is over here. The wool combing factory is there. And on the other side of the river is where the SA set up wild concentration camps. I have not been able to locate exactly where. This is all very much word of mouth, but this is the neighborhood where they picked him up. And somewhere over here, they beat and tortured him and detained him. So if that happens to you, if your husband is taken away, you're sitting there with 10 kids, you don't know where they take him, you don't know whether you're going to get him back or when, that is evidently a major trauma to happen to somebody. Now, of course, you have a community, you have the union, even though it's outlawed, so you're going to muddle through, but every day you're going to wonder, where is my husband now? What's he doing? Eventually, the Nazis formalized the process of terror. They put the SS in charge, not the SA, and they pulled the inmates together into larger concentration camps, mostly labor camps. So for my great-grandmother, that meant he was taken from the wild campsite here to one of the labor camps in the Ems River concentration camp system, Emslandlager. And this is what I had pointed out to you earlier, the peat bog landscape of North Germany, which is where, in the most remote places conceivable, for a place as densely populated as Germany, that is. These labor camps were where liberals, socialists, communists, union members, etc. found themselves. Many of them had been in artistic professions or the media, like I said, lawyers, politicians, activists. This is literally at that site. The commander of the camp is giving instructions to the inmates. They have a kind of, roll call, as it were. And you can see that their clothing still looks like they've only just got there. So they're not yet walking skeletons. One of the people, once you read Benjamin Carter Head's book that's on the reading list for you to buy, The Death of Democracy, you'll encounter this man, Hans Litten. Top left photograph, he was one of the liberal lawyers in the Weimar Republic who actually cornered Hitler in a legal proceeding once. The point of that legal proceeding was precisely what I was talking about. To what extent was party leadership responsible for the violence that the Nazi thugs committed in the streets? And to what extent could they wash their hands of it and say, well, perfectly justified, of course, understandable, certainly, but we had nothing to do with it. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. So in a way, the communication between Hitler and his private army worked in the same fashion as that between Trump and the Proud Boys. Will you disavow them? Okay, fine, I disavow. Stand back and stand by. I had nothing to do with that. Who are these people? It's just some guy in the basement. So Litten actually assembled evidence. He did the thorough, lawyerly work, and I forget who actually was suing here, but he ended up putting Hitler in a court and on the spot saying, did you know this? This says you knew it. Here you say you didn't know it. Here you're telling people to use violent means. Here you're saying I had nothing to do with it. So the judge, of course, like all the judges, was a holdover of the empire, of the imperial Germany. They were all reactionaries. He liked Hitler. He disliked Litten, little impertinent Jew. So Hitler got off in spite of the evidence. But he never forgot Litten. So he was one of the first people to end up in the Emsland. Litten, good liberal that he is, said, look, it's a big mistake. I didn't mean to do this. And if you let me out, I'll never say anything political ever again. Okay, just let me go. His mother intervened on his behalf. They wrote many, many letters. British, French lawyers' organizations wrote letters, human rights groups, and said, this is a harmless man. He will never bother you again. Won't you just please let him out? And the Nazis, with glee, said, Litten stays where he is. And published that in the press. You know, this is one of the leading figures of what's wrong with Weimar, where these Jewish liberal pests could just sue you and think they could get away with it, you know, because apparently that's how it worked. He died in that camp, 1937, age 34. The press, the enemies of the people, the lying press, the Lügenpresse, were also high on the list of desirable targets to lock up in these first days. Imagine Rachel Maddow, imagine CNN announcers and so forth, imagine NPR, New York Times, Washington Post, etc., being marched off to a labor camp. Many people would find that rather enjoyable. So here you have the leadership of the Reichsrundfunk, the National Broadcasting Service, the director, journalists, announcers, prominent people all. So they're all at the level of household names. Photographs taken once again to show we won. And this is now what we're doing. And people, for the most part, you know, many people were shocked, many people were stunned, but many just nodded along and said, yes, this makes sense. They probably had it coming. Members of satirists, people who were in the business of making fun of those in power. Oh, gee, I forget his name. I wrote it down and now I forgot it. This is his group before the rise to power of the Nazis. And then he was brought into the concentration camp. Remember, this is the formalized version of the camps. The SA, the wild camps, were where they just arbitrarily tortured people who they knew from previous encounters. You know, they were like the individual personal enemies from street battles and politics. The SS is a whole lot more cool in their assessment. They see people who they don't know, and they recognize them as socialists, liberals, etc., and they torture them for that regardless. It's nothing personal, but it's even more efficient. And there are just murders, we should call them. The paperwork would always say, shot in the back during a flight attempt, shot multiple times from all directions during a flight attempt, apparent suicide. So people, even the authorities, like the non-Nazi party authorities, holdovers, local constables, whatever, judges, mayors, would say, hold on, shouldn't we investigate this? And they were told that if they knew what's good for them, they should probably not investigate this. It took a long time before this site, and it's a network of camps. This is just Esterwegen, the center of it, where the memorial is now located. It's almost 2-hour drive from Bremen. Can't really get there on public transportation. Very unlikely for that in Germany. You can get anywhere by public transportation, but this is so remote, you can't. They made it into a memorial. These groups of bushes here are trimmed to take up exactly the amount of space that the barracks would have at the time. So you have here along the main road of the camp with barbed wire all around. You have these groups of barracks. Here's a view from the path to the site. You see how large this is. Here you have the inmates harvesting peat. You can see here, this is like the natural surface. Once the peat bog is drained, it's still pretty soggy, but then you can start cutting little blocks out of it. What it is used for, if you ever get earth for planting, that's peat, a big part of it. Peat is like organic matter that is not decomposed, actually, because it lacks the oxygen for that. And it's been sitting for a very long time, thousands of years, under so much water in the dark that it wouldn't decompose. So it is chock full of energy. And you can burn it for in ovens. You can use it for fertilizer. You can use it for sanitation. Like if you have an outhouse, you can put a handful of peat on top every time you go, and it won't smell. You can use it for fertilizer later. So all these things are uses for peat. But it's a backbreaking process of harvesting it. And here, as elsewhere, the point was to to squeeze the labor out of people, but if they died in the process, that was a desirable side effect. Prisoners of war began to fill up these camps pretty soon, like especially Polish and Soviet. They took so many people captive that they really filled up all the camps with them. Here you have, the classical Darth Vader Sturmhelm, German soldier with his machine gun in the watchtower, like every German who will say had a relative die in the concentration camp, fell off the watchtower. That's the guy. And you can see here the little railroad cars where the peat is transported. You can easily put the tracks into, pick them up, lay them down again. If you run in the remote areas, if you run across 600 millimeter crooked track someplace, you can just about guess that there's a peat harvesting operation underway nearby. And the SS, as you can see, is running this. Again, this is not something that happens in secrecy. It is something that happens and is well advertised. Oh, hold on. Right, I wanted to point out There's a little spot here that housed the kitchens. So malnutrition was a huge issue for these laborers. And this is the record of a government doctor who comes there in 1942, I want to say, and says these people are getting just enough to eat to sustain themselves if they didn't work. But they're working like 10-hour shifts, backbreaking labor. So this is not sustainable. This is not healthy. But it was not a shameful thing that they did to hide from the public. No, the picture I showed you with the SS runes over the main gate appeared in an illustrated magazine that people would have on their coffee tables, read to their older children, see what good things a government is doing. Here you have a picture to show the inherent racial inferiority of people who end up in these places. They have that gene that makes them antisocial, welfare recipients, communists, people who don't want to work for themselves. By contrast, the Siegfried-like, heroic, blonde, blue-eyed, chiseled look of the German soldier, we're doing them a favor. We're giving them something useful to do, even though, they definitely shouldn't be let out into the general public. They shouldn't be allowed to breed and produce offspring. But this is the best that they can expect. We're actually being generous to them here. Not just to one's own public did the Nazis advertise these camps as a beneficial institution, but also internationally to the Red Cross. So when somebody said, well, can we please take a look at what you're doing in these camps? They were like, sure, come on by. Esterwegen is nice this time of year. And the observers returned and didn't sugarcoat it, but it was nevertheless something that the Nazis were proud of displaying. One of the special features of this particular camp camp system was just how many entertainers, artists, and musicians there. So in spite of all the horror, they put on shows. They wrote dance and cabaret reviews. They sang, danced, built stages, and whatnot. And sometimes the sheet music and text of some of those numbers would be smuggled out in the pockets of Red Cross workers who came there. The text of one of these, I want to play you in the remaining 5 minutes here. There are two versions of it. One is sung by Ernst Busch in German.
Wohin auch das Auge blicket, Moor und Heide nur ringsum, Vogelsang und nicht erquicket, Eichen stehen kahl und krumm. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten bis uns. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten bis uns. Auf und nieder gehen die Posten, keiner kann hindurch. Flucht wird nur das Leben kosten, vierfach ist umzäunt die Burg. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und fliegen im Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Doch für uns gibt es kein Klagen, ewig kann's nicht Winter sein. Einmal werden froh wir sagen, Heimat, du bist wieder mein. Dann sing die Morgengagen, nicht mehr mit dem Spaten, bevor man sie nicht mehr mit dem Spaten.
Notice the title of the album issued by various figures in the International Brigades. Now, before we listen to Paul Robeson again, I want to point you to one incident that happened in 1948. Robeson, Seeger, and others kept performing together after the war, now directing their attention towards segregation and lynchings in the South. Many soldiers had returned from the war, Black soldiers to the South, to come to the conclusion that what they found there was not that similar from what they had just fought against in Europe. The events of 1948, when McCarthyism really took off, seemed to confirm that in many ways. At a concert in Peekskill, New York, there had been agitation before among the local population. And by the time that the concert started, there was a white supremacist mob that attacked people who attended the concert with stones, baseball bats, fists, and so forth, while police stood by. And when they finally intervened, it was to arrest and beat up the trade union members who had come to guard the performers. After that, Robeson's concerts across the United States were canceled. He was blacklisted, banned, his passport taken away, and he died old and embittered. And his voice, once they gave him back his passport, it was no longer what it had been. And he's been largely forgotten. He's been made forgotten. At that time, he was an All-American football player. He was scrubbed from the record. His name was, he had played for Princeton, Rutgers. His name was erased from the record and from the Hall of Fame and so forth, from the photographs. So this tells you something about the continuity of anti-communism between Nazi Germany and the post-war order set up in the name of the free world under the tutelage of the United States. If it tells you all you need to know about that is a different question, but it does tell you something significant. And this message was not lost on the Germans who observed McCarthyism and who observed the American way of making friends and making enemies in the Cold War. It looked suspiciously like our old friends and our old enemies. So, wait, I actually wanted to play this. So, YouTube, take it away.
Far and wide as the eye can wander, heath and bog are everywhere. Not a bird sings out to cheer us, oaks are standing gaunt and bare. We are Pittsburgh soldiers, we're marching with our spades to the bog. Up and down the guards are pacing, no one can go through. Flight would mean a sure death facing, guns and barbed wire greet our view. We are Pittsburgh soldiers, we're marching with our spades to the bog. But for us there is no complaining. Winter will in time be past. One day we shall cry rejoicing, homeland dear, you're mine at last. rest. Then will the of soldiers march no more with their spades to the bog. Doch für uns gibt es kein Klagen, ewig kann's nicht Winter sein. Einmal werden froh wir sagen, Heimat, du bist wieder mein. Dann singen die Marschsoldaten nicht mehr mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Dann singen die Marschsoldaten nicht mehr mit dem Spaten ins Moor.
One more thing I just remembered about Robeson and his solo albums. One particular bestseller was Songs of Free Men, where among this tune there were Jewish cantations, American folk songs, slave spirituals, British folk songs, Soviet folk songs, and Russian, including the legendary fight song of the Red Cavalry, Polishka Polye, and a couple of other of those things. So you see there as well, you have a fairly broad range of references to emphasize that this is a global struggle. Paul Robeson was the voice of America, or the voice of freedom. He was the leading representative of an American government entertainment/propaganda effort to raise public opinion against fascism. In this capacity here, he is shown September 21st, 1942, singing with workers in a racially integrated shipyard in Oakland, California. So this is, apropos, a shipyard. It is also apropos because these shipyards were put out of business right around the same time. The devastation in South Central Los Angeles and Oakland that I mentioned resembles that in my hometown and in my old neighborhood. Robeson understood the struggle against fascism as one for humanity and for solidarity between people of different backgrounds, of a working class struggle against capital. And if you wonder why you have never heard about him, there's a guy named McCarthy. I'm going to continue the lecture, Death by Labor, where we start out with a closer look at the Emsland system of concentration camps, where liberals, socialists, communists, producers of art and culture, and so forth were incarcerated and forced to labor in the peat bogs. Smuggled out from there was the sheet music of this song. The first rendition of which I played you is sung by Ernst Busch. And I don't think I discussed Ernst Busch on the last occasion. Ernst Busch was evidently free to sing this song. So he was, although a communist, he was not in Germany. He had made it out in time. He had, as a musician, but also there as a soldier, he had volunteered for the International Brigade that fought to defend the Spanish Republic against the fascist uprising by General Franco. Here, of course, he met and collaborated with a host of other people you might have heard about: Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, Woody Guthrie, and then also by extension, when it comes to Woody Guthrie, you saw maybe that one of the albums on which this song was published in English was by Pete Seeger working together with Paul Robeson. So Robeson, of course, was the official spokesperson for the American anti-fascist propaganda in the war. He hosted large concerts on aircraft carriers and in steel mills and shipyards. Robeson also, along with A. Philip Randolph, the socialist leader of the sleeping car porter union, was a major figurehead in the civil rights movement. And of course, Randolph goes on to convene the March on Washington alongside Martin Luther King. So here is a direct connection that these people make politically between the anti-fascist struggle, an aggressively imperialist, racist, pro-capitalist ideology that flanks and enables and is geared towards the exploitation of labor, resources, whole countries, and so forth. So they saw that as one and the same global struggle. Apparently, so did the Nazis. Germany, of course, used the Spanish Civil War as a trial run for the Air Force. The German Air Force got its first combat experience flying under Spanish colors for Franco in the Spanish Civil War. The first carpet bombing of a civilian target was by a German aircraft of the city of Guernica in the Basque country, which of course is a painting that you associate with Picasso. And certainly the Nazis would have been the first ones to concede that. It is a global struggle between fascism and socialism, democracy, human rights, and all those things. But when you mention that the Nazis were fascists, that they were capitalists, that they were anti-communists, you immediately get protests from the right. The only tweet I ever sent, other than one where they tried to get me for accusing me that I incited violence against Trump and Republicans, of recent vintage, where there were over 40,000 views, was when some little Nazi protested that I had said that the Nazis were capitalists. And the point he made was they were socialists. I mean, they're called National Socialists after all. This is an item of faith, and it goes back all the way to Friedrich Hayek, one of the heroes of libertarianism, who in the 1940s, before capitulation already, said Hitler was fainting right, but really he was a leftist at heart. If you look at mainstream liberal press, The Economist, Forbes, other such publications, there too you will find people regularly assuming as a given that the Nazis were on the left. Dinesh D'Souza, who published a book in 2017 or 18, that is called The Big Lie, The Fascist Roots of American Liberalism, also says that there is a direct line of tradition. It's all Marxism. It's all an attempt to undermine good Christian order and a proper social, order that is based on nature. So that this argument can be made, that books like D'Souza's get reviewed in the New York Times as if they were a serious contribution to public debate, is in itself a testament to the ignorance, half education, and provincialism of American liberals. But if you had asked a Nazi, were they socialists? Were they Marxists? Were they communists? Did they like all those things? The first thing that they would have told you is no. The whole point here is to fight against communism. That is the purpose of all this. And yes, of course, the Jew stands behind communism and capitalism. And that's the ultimate evil. But communism is the main manifestation of that evil in the world that we have to fight. It is the source of all evil. So we'll get to that in more detail later on, how they squared that, to say that the Jew is responsible for capitalism and communism. You see that Henry Ford is listed among the readings. Here is somebody then who argues that. So if you read just that short article, he makes that case. But even before Operation Barbarossa, Hitler in early 1941 introduced his higher ranking army officers to this idea that whatever chivalrous notion of warfare they maintained, they needed to ditch that. These are people who we want to exterminate. The good Russian people, perhaps not too smart, but also not vicious. Good workers, if you treat them with a firm hand, but not inherently communist, misled, oppressed, waiting simply for us to come in and liberate them. There is a story of a warlord who fought with the white Russians, like with the anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik Russians around 1920, that I want to lecture about in a bit more detail later. The Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, another hero of the far right in this country. If you look closely, again, my evidence here based on Twitter, if you say something critical about the guy, it brings out the vultures. But he very much operated with the very same assumption that all it takes for communism to topple in Russia is for somebody to come in and basically take away the top tier of the cadre. So, and those, as well as anybody who didn't join in, who kept insisting on fighting the Germans, those you could easily treat as subhuman, and annihilation, extermination by labor was the proper response to that. The idea that Bolshevism, that Marxism is what undermines Western civilization and proper order, Christianity, the family, authority, and so forth, runs through Nazi propaganda like a red thread, just as much as the idea that cultural Marxism is behind woke ideology and the mind virus of the wokeness and so forth is an item of faith among the right in this country today. Why do these nefarious liberal professors teach people to hate you? Because they're Marxists, and that is their long-term plan. If you look at the at the speech President Trump gave at Mount Rushmore in 2020, he lays that out as an argument. Why are there Black Lives Matter protests? Because these young people have no interest in contributing productively to a society. They have been incited by liberal journalists, artists, professors, teachers to hate America and to want to bring it down. So this is Marxism at work. You have others from the same camp who will also then argue, because this is very much like an amalgamation of anti-Semitic tropes and anti-communist ones. You nevertheless have people who then also turn around to cite Karl Marx's On the Jewish Question as evidence that what drove Marx really was anti-Semitism, which is why, of course, the far right is such good friends with the Jews/Israel today. This is based on a probably halfway willful, halfway uninformed misreading of On the Jewish Question, which I also wish to revisit. But here you have a typical Nazi cartoon. The ugly caricature of the Jewish capitalist carries his money bag full of stuff he stole from honest, hardworking German people. And here is the Social Democrat. His hat says Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD. It also has the hammer and sickle. So it's saying, they say they're Democrats. They say they don't want communism, but really that's what they want. In the same fashion as the Democrats in this country are a radical left Marxist club that is trying to undermine proper order. So here's the guardian angel of the Jew. Marxism is really protecting capitalism. And we'll return to the question of what exactly do they mean when they say capitalism in a minute. Nazi propaganda is consistently anti-Jewish by virtue of being anti-Bolshevik. It is also anti-capitalist by virtue of being anti-Semitic. So here you have the poster that says, behind the enemies is the Jew. And the contrast is here you have racially superior, hardworking, honest, loyal, etc. Germans who are up against the Jew painted in as ugly as possible colors. What does communism do? It goes and threatens your women and your children, just like the woke language in the classroom is designed to degrade the family and the natural order of things. The Russian soldiers came to Europe to rape, and the propaganda reels of the Nazis in the last couple of weeks of the war presented these stories as fact that mass violence against women was part of the way that the Russians conducted warfare, which is natural because that's how the commies function. This, of course, is a ginormous effort at projection, because if you look at the actual conduct of the German army, not just the SS, in Eastern Europe, violence against women was ubiquitous. That was indeed part of what defined the Nazi ethos. Once we talk about the gender politics of fascism, Klaus Teweleit's book, Male Fantasies, the militias that became the nucleus, the first founders of the Nazi movement in Germany, soldiers complete in their unit back from the battlefields of Ukraine, where they had maintained a German client state. To sort humanity into worthy and unworthy, and the female part of unworthy humanity into basically objects for use, is an inherent part of the Nazi mindset. So nevertheless, this view of the communist, and here you see this is a Polish language poster, has lots of traction throughout Europe to convince even occupied and oppressed people, because Poland certainly wasn't invited to be part of the Nazi sphere of hegemony in any way, that the Nazis are still fighting for them and in their interest. Once more, an ugly caricature of the vaguely subhuman Asiatic Russian menace on the left. Here, to announce an art exhibit, Bolshevism with its mask off, in Berlin in 1937. By contrast here, the ideal type of the heroic, strong, simple, perhaps, but honest German, who, by eliminating that which is degenerate, would set the world back on a path towards virtue, order, and all the good stuff. Another country where the propaganda fell on open ears was the Netherlands. And don't mention that to Dutch people. They like to look at themselves as all victims. But the thousands of people in the SS Standard Westland would disagree. This is why I'm going to talk about the Nazis in the family on another occasion, but my grandfather maternally was stationed in the Netherlands with the, what do you call that? The motor corps, I guess, like with the people in charge of maintaining the trucks and so forth. They were also the ones who had the sign-up centers for volunteers. So I believe he must have been, surprisingly wasn't involved with this recruitment effort directly. And if you join up, you become part of this heroic effort with a fist that smashes all the Jewish-influenced, non-Aryan, globalist degenerates in this world. It's an anti-Bolshevik crusade. So capitalism, communism, all the same, things that undermine the stability, autonomy, morality of local communities. Marxism is the ideology of choice, with liberalism being just a sub-variant for people who say that there is equality. Reading Henry Ford, you'll find that he's saying, who came up with this idea of equality? Why, Jews, of course, so they could all the better hide the inherent difference between this amorphous notion of equality that sets up a standard where it's not okay to treat them differently, even though they really had it coming. And then, of course, the application of this idea, of this Enlightenment notion of equality to all kinds of people, nations, races, etc. The idea of internationalism, when somebody like a leader of the Spanish Republic says, the whole idea of nationalism is a charade, because I, as a worker, have more in common with an Italian, with a Russian, with a German worker, with an Arab worker from Morocco than I have with my ruling class and with the priests and the bishops in the Spanish Catholic Church. So this idea of humanity, of human emancipation was alien to fascism. That was the goal that they were up against. And that had strong appeal. Even in the early 1930s, studies that I mentioned before, where Americans, well-educated Americans, come to Italy, look around, see fascism and love it, and want some of that for themselves, that is a fairly normal reaction about an educated upper middle class. And in different countries, this has more or less support. Norway, to its credit, the popular support for fascism is minor, but they have a highly motivated and willing collaborator, Vidkun Quisling, who, of course, if you've heard it used as a derogatory term, to be a Quisling is synonymous with being a collaborator, like a collaborator who goes that extra mile. He sends thousands of young Norwegian men into the trenches, into losing positions in Eastern Europe against the Russians. In Belgium, there's the tragic figure of Leon de Grey, who leads the Francophone Belgian fascists. The Nazis treat him like an unwanted stepchild because they already have the Flamish, which is to say Dutch-speaking Belgian fascists, the Vlaams Belang. So de Grey is desperately trying to weasel himself into the good favors of the Nazis. He is volunteering money, he's collecting money for the war effort, he's volunteering men, and the Nazis are all like, yeah, thanks, now go away, please. We don't want you to play with us. So, and then eventually he survives the war. He's too minor a war criminal to even get picked up, and he moves to Spain. There are still many people in Belgium who adore him. Ante Pavelic rules as head of his Ustasha movement, a Croatian client state that commits genocide among Bosnians, Serbs, and other ethnic minorities, Sinti and Roma, and of course Jews. And in France, Marshal Pétain governs the Vichy regime, which is signaling its affinity with Nazism by calling the state the French state. So it is not the French Republic, but rather it's a state. You can't call it a monarchy because you have cut off the line of legitimate succession. But what it is saying is we're going back to a point before 1776. I mean, sorry, in this case, 1789. The age of revolution was a mistake. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood do not exist. Those are Jewish liberal delusions. Question?
That's the guy that would eventually be the leader of the puppet state, right?
That's Pétain. Yeah, that is him as leader of the of Vichy France. Yeah. But it's not just Pétain. It is not just that everybody else was against it. You might have heard about a movie called The Sorrow and the Pity, which is it's a long French documentary, absolutely necessary to watch for historians, because the squirming of the Frenchman, who the author of the film confronts and says, what was it like to live under the Vichy regime? And then he has evidence, newspaper articles, people giving interviews and so forth, showing how they collaborated. So in France too, after the war, everybody was a resistance fighter. Strangely enough, same thing in Germany. During the war, however, there was not just army recruits. There was an SS volunteer brigade of Frenchmen, many of them old French nobility. Yeah.
I was gonna say, didn't the French and German people, it was like oil and water, like they didn't mix, they didn't like each other, right?
You'd think so. Yeah, certainly the ancient enemy of France that was held up to Germans, that was a trope. But Nazi propaganda during the war was emphasizing the common Germanic roots and the unfortunate dilution of the Germanic spirit among the French by Jewish and Roman influence. However, they held the door open and said, anybody can and should join us in our war against the commies. Anybody who's, sufficiently racially pure. So in a perverted kind of fashion, the idea that citizenship belonging to a state is defined not by ethnicity, but by political sympathy, the Nazis had very much an open-ended invitation for people to come and join them. Where that line was drawn depended who you asked. But you even have old colonial officers who are saying, yes, of course, heroic African warriors are exactly what we need. We saw these people close up, their military spirit is unmatched, and they would join us, their way of life, the purity of these tribal communities is just like what we used to have here when we were still Germanic. So clearly it is about an assumption of racial supremacy. And when it comes down to it, and there are French troops on the front line, and it is the practical question is who is going to sit in that trench that is going to be overrun by Russian tanks in 2 minutes? It's going to be the French, not your German troops. Still, when things were going well and when there was loot to distribute, the invitation was everybody can join us. Let's go get the commies. The anti-Semitism in a direct contrast between honest hard work of Germans without second thoughts, without deception. The German will tell you what he thinks and will have a square deal for you and so forth. On the other hand, you have the ugly Jew who always has some contract in his pocket, a lawyer waiting in the wings, is dealing with money, is dealing in abstractions to get the money that he didn't work for to appropriate it. So yes, the Nazis were people who channeled anti-capitalism. And if you define it in the way they did, capitalism is when Jews manipulate you with money and people take your money that you have earned through hard work. That's when capitalism, then it makes sense internally, to say this is why we are anti-capitalists. Exploitation is when Jews raise grain prices. Exploitation is when Jews charge interest. Exploitation is when Jews deal in stocks. And if you go against all those things, by removing the Jews from the economy, from positions of power and so forth, then capitalism, the economy, a free market is restored to its natural, basically social Darwinist basis, whereby hard work you succeed, and where you get to keep the proceeds of your hard work, and you don't have to give that away to exploiters. So when people felt pressed economically, the Nazis would say, even after they took power, they would say, well, who's really coming for your money? Who's exploiting you? It's the Jews, but also the racially inferior, the subhumans, people who are sick, handicapped, mentally disabled, physically disabled. Look at what it costs to put somebody like that in a hospital, in a school, in a mental institution, how many people have to work for a year to sustain one person who is mentally or physically disabled? So not to be able to work and yet to be sustained is something we cannot afford. And if you can't feed your children, and if you can't afford rent, ask yourself whether it may not be because your money goes towards Jews and other inherently inferiors. So the view of what a properly working free market should look like is when it really is a struggle for survival. But of course, you're going to be doing fine because you are honest and hardworking, and you would already be doing fine because you're doing everything right if it wasn't for these people who somehow weasel you out of your money. So the propaganda posters, this is what your taxes pay for. When I see the bumper stickers that say, keep working, millions on welfare depend on it, this is the poster that pops into my mind. This, up to when they reach their 60th birthday, a person who is ill by inheritance costs an average of 50,000 mark, Reichsmark, to sustain. So this costs you your money. And for comparison, remember when they built the government for the damage to the bunker, for the bombing rate, it was 12,000. So this is a substantial sum of money at the time. So no, the Nazis' anti-capitalism, the Nazis' socialism should not distract us from the fact that this diagram here of the submarine assembly plant that was being built with slave labor in Bremen, this is what fascism does for capital. It provides, through war, opportunities for profit and plunder. And even on May 3rd, 1945, the engineering bureau in charge of the construction site would, as a matter of course, sign their letter with the business version of Heil Hitler, mit deutschen Gruß. And this is what fascism means for labor: hunger, terror, and death. It is not an accident that the first people they came for were communists, socialists, and the unions. So what happened to my great-grandfather? He was released around 1938. I don't have very many, I don't have any documents, to be honest. It's all stories told around dinner or, when we have coffee and cake. But the story, as far as I'm aware, is he got out after his wife made a bargain with the authorities and said, I'll take your stupid medal that you want to pin on me for bearing 10 children, 10 Aryan children, blonde and blue-eyed, if you give me back your husband, my husband. So they did. This is not my great-grandmother. This is a different woman in Berlin. You see here the teenage girls on the right-hand side. They're members of the party girls organization, the Bund Deutscher Mädels, BDM. The members of which organization were often encouraged to mingle with the male Hitler youth. They set up, and this is about the gender politics too, we'll revisit that. They'll set up adjacent unsupervised campsites in the high summer and then send people home. The more pregnant, the merrier, and encourage people to have Aryan children out of wedlock. So here, motherhood, having babies, making babies is all what this is about. And the honor for this poor, super tired looking woman who probably already lost at least one son in the war, is getting the mother's cross pinned on her by a Nazi party official. This is the one that my grandmother would have been given. They did not keep that. Unlike the box with the union funds and the gun, this was not part of the heirloom, but this is the one you get in gold, first class, for having 8 or more children. The propaganda about this was also very clear. If you have kids, we'll take good care of you. We'll make sure they're healthy, well-fed, educated, all the way to the point where they can either breed more Aryans or march off to war. Every 10-year-old, must join the Hitler Youth. Youth serves the leader, Jugend dient dem Führer. So what happened to my great-grandfather's children, my granduncles? This is the picture after the Battle of Stalingrad, or during. Out of my 8 granduncles, 7 ended up in a place like this. They were sent east. They were with that army that was encircled and wiped out in Stalingrad, and they didn't come back. So in the end, as it turns out, the Nazis had the last laugh. My great-grandmother got her husband back, but she had to give up her children. They now belong to the Führer. So in the end, it was 3 of them, survivors, who I met. That concludes this lecture about what the Lager in the Emsland, what the concentration camp system, where the purpose was death by labor, tells us about fascism and capitalism.